evening. So today I want to take you on a little bit of a journey, but I'll describe what we're going to be doing to connect with the different movements that a baby makes during the first year of their life. And we've all done these movements, but also the basis for these movements develops in the womb. So I'm going to start with describing in the womb. Why is it helpful to understand this? Because all these different movements do help with our brain development, and sometimes people don't necessarily fully integrate the movements. There are primitive reflexes that support the development of the movements as well, and sometimes people skip a movement, but also I want parents and other health professionals to be aware of how important it is, if we're working with parents and babies, to respect the natural order of movements and the natural integration of reflexes. Because if we try and do movements, if we encourage a baby to do movements that are beyond the stage at which they're integrating a previous movement, it can be a bit confusing for the brain, and it can interfere with the integration of the movements of their reflexes and of movements which affect brain development and affect coordination. But the good news is you can go back. I often find that often if there's imbalances, they can show again at adolescence. And so we work with, you can work with children, but you don't have to wait till their adolescence. You can work with children at any age, either through touch or through movement, just helping them get a sense of this order of movement. I'm presenting it in quite a linear way, but the essence of one movement is already there before it becomes integrated. It's not that you do one and then another movement appears. So if you're observing a baby, if you have a young baby and you're observing them, you'll see that they actually do probably all of the movements, and they seem to be moving in quite a random way. But if you watch carefully, you'll see there are certain moments when they do integrate a movement or they are expressing a reflex. And then you can think, oh yeah, okay, my baby's integrated that. So I'll first explain the movements before we start practicing them. Also to say that as an adult, we obviously don't have the same flexibility as a child, especially as a baby, but also our body proportions are quite different. So it's actually hard for us to completely imitate the movements. So when we practice them, we'll just be doing the best we can. Otherwise, we can just imagine the movements. So the first movement is, I forgot that, also an important part, that the movements link to different animal movements. And so there are many people working with children that say many theories about how we're actually, in our journey through life, in our growth and development of our physical body, we're actually mirroring the evolution of life on Earth, starting with animals emerging from water onto land. So it's millions and millions of years of evolution. So we'll start with the first movements, and the first movements are also the basis for our brain development and for all the structures in our body. And this is when we're 2 weeks after conception. Our physical body is just a flat line. So we have a top and a bottom and a front and a back, but we're basically just flat. It's a bilaminar disc. And we can say, because we're in water, this disc is very fluid. It will eventually form our spine and our digestive system, but it's not nearly as rigid as that. And it's really very watery, like a water snake. So you can see it as being a very primitive creature in the water, floating around, a little snake, a tadpole, something like that, very fluid, and it can move in lots of different ways. But quite quickly after that, by 8 weeks after conception, we've developed our umbilical cord. And so we actually then, for the rest of our time in the womb, we're organising around our navel, and we're receiving our nourishment, but we're also eliminating through our navel. So this is really the centre from which everything else expands. And in traditional Chinese medicine, this is considered a really important energy centre as well, the dantian, which you've probably heard of, and the source of life, the gate of life. And I find, especially in modern culture, when we're so much into stimulating our brain and our head and our upper body, it's really good to come back to the centre and to also begin to think of doing movements from our centre and letting our brain calm down a bit, come back to the centre. And the animal stage for this is really a starfish. When with a baby, the proportions are different, as I already said. So the head is much bigger and it's very close to the heart and resting on the heart. Because by then the flat snake has curled into the fetal position. And we're actually now organising around our umbilical cord, which is here. And we've got our 2 legs, because at 8 weeks we have developed our legs and our arms. And we've got feet. They actually come from our feet first and our hands first, the limb buds. And then we get our arms. And that's actually how our body not only moves, but how it develops. Because our hands are close to our heart and our feet are close to our future pelvis, but our kidneys, which are low down, and our reproductive organs, and then they actually grow out from the feet and fill in with the legs. So that's also a movement pattern, but it's also our awareness after we're born. But coming back to the womb, we don't move very much, but we're organising around our centre, and of course we're contained in water. We're very watery, and we could say that we're like a starfish, because we have our 2 arms, our 2 legs, but we also have a head and a tail. So we're coming in this kind of movement. And then at birth, well, even in the womb, you'll see that some of the movement patterns, obviously this isn't, well, not obviously, but this isn't the only movement that we do in the womb. It's not a linear thing, as I was saying, but this is the dominant movement. But of course, we could cross over our arms or cross our legs, and we do all different kinds of movements. Obviously, we're a bit limited with what we can do, but the reflexes are starting to develop as we develop in the womb that will accompany the integration of the movements when we're born and after birth. So during birth, we actually are stimulating the midline, because of course a baby's spine at birth is not as developed as it's going to be at the end of the first year or even later on in our life. It's not as fluid as it was at 2 weeks. It's obviously grown a lot during the 9 months of pregnancy, and it's much stronger, but it's still got lots of developing to do. And the midline in Chinese medicine is the conception vessel at the front and the governing vessel at the back, the basic yin and yang, like a bit like the chakras in Indian systems. It's from this will emerge all our structure, but also it's very related not only to just our spine and our physical strength, but our digestive system. And our basic digestive system develops from just the basic gut, and then it differentiates into the different organs. So this has also got to develop as well, not just the movement, but the digestive system, because at birth, of course, after birth, well, sorry, I should say birth, the birth itself strengthens this midline. I just wanted to say, don't only focus on the spine itself, but also the digestive system, the mouth, the movement of the neck and the head, the movement of the whole digestive system down into the pelvis. And as we're strengthening this, we do movements with our head. If we're born vaginally, there's movement of the head and the neck, which will strengthen the mouth and the top part of the digestive system. There's movements also down into the shoulder, which again is another potential strengthening for this movement of the 2 arms. And then there's movements that strengthen our digestive system in the pelvis, our pelvis itself, and then a movement down into the legs. And often there's a little pushing of the 2 feet that brings us out into the world. And so when we're born, we still have to develop this midline movement of the snake. And we could say that this now is a snake on the land. There's a lot less flexibility. And there are lots of reflexes that support this movement. Like, for example, the rooting reflex, where when you have a newborn baby, you see how much they're led by their mouth. And this is one of the reflexes that supports the development of the digestive system, but also the strength of the midline. And also the anus is important, because we've organised around our navel for our food, but now we have to shift. And so that in itself starts to strengthen the midline, the top and the bottom, but all of it. And then there are also different turning reflexes and movements so that we can actually move our spine. Maybe I should do some of these because it's like we're a snake. No, we're going to do the movements in a minute. I have to explain them first. We're a snake on land. And so like a snake, we're presenting more the front of our body. So that helps develop the digestive system, but also tone, muscle tone in the body, which will eventually be important for helping us to stand. But also it develops the spine, and the spine, the movements we need to have rotational movements, which will help us with rolling. We need to have flexion and extension on the two sides of the spine. So there are lots of different movements that help the spine to develop in all those different ways, spine and digestive system. And then after the snake, or at the same time as the snake, because in the womb we have been organising around the navel, we start to develop a bit more of this movement of our two arms and our two legs. So we're not like a starfish anymore, but we still have this central area which is important. And we can say that this is going through the amphibian stage. So an animal that has come from water, that can live in water, like we've been living in water, but then learns to move on the land. And we could give an example of that as a frog. And frogs, you can see in a frog, they're a bit like a baby in a way. They have a big belly, a big head in relation to their body, and then they've got their front legs and their back legs, and they move them. Basically, we know that this movement is integrated when a baby can kind of pull themselves with both arms and push and pull with both legs. So it's basically the two arms can move together. There's a coordination of movement between two arms. And in terms of awareness of the brain, it's like, oh, I've got an upper body. And I'm becoming aware first of my upper body, or first, but I become aware I have an upper body, but I also become aware I have a lower body. So I'm doing movements of my two legs. And one of the main reflexes that supports this is the Moro reflex, the startle reflex, which we can see at birth when babies. One of the reasons people say it's developed is so that we can take our first breath, we can open our lungs, it can help us open our lungs, but it's also helping us to integrate this movement of an upper body movement. And we can see even in adults, the primitive reflexes aren't always integrated. So if you see an adult and sometimes there's something that startles them, and they're obviously not going to do that, but you might see there's a movement of both arms at the same time, and then you know that the Moro reflex isn't fully integrated. We also know this movement is integrated because the baby can show us in that they bring their hands or their feet together, but they're aware. Because of course babies before that, they are touching their hands and their feet, but you'll see that they're not really aware that they're doing it. It all feels quite random, but all of a sudden, they put their hands together and you can see something changes in their brain, and it's like, oh, and that actually does develop. As I say, it's very linked to brain development. It's a very centering movement in many spiritual practices, like the prayer gesture, Anjali Mudra in yoga. It's very centering, and that's quite important for babies to feel that connection, that they're not just lost in space, because when a baby's born, it's quite a lot to take in. And so they know eventually they can come back to themselves, and that's really important. And they can bring their heart in and come back to themselves. And then the same with the feet. You'll see babies playing with their feet, and then at some point they're like, oh, I can bring both feet together. We'll explore this in different positions in a minute because I want to get you to do the movements, but that's just to explain a bit the order. So the next movement that we integrate is a movement of the side, and there are reflexes that support this, where basically the leg and the arm of the same side do the same movement. So if they both flex, and then on the other side they might both extend, but it's not quite as clear as that in a baby. But you know that it's integrated when the baby can start rolling a bit, but also when they consciously bring their hand and their foot together. But that's bringing their awareness away from their center. So that's why as a parent, we don't really want to be encouraging them, oh yeah, let's take my baby's hand and put it on their foot, because they've missed out that awareness of traveling from their center in their awareness to their foot, and then it's like, oh, then their brain makes it in their time. So it's important to respect the movements that the baby's doing and not force a movement, not anticipate a movement, because that can be a bit destabilizing for the baby. So that's a movement more of a reptile. And the movements, as I said, that support it are sort of rolling movements, and when the same side does the same thing, flexion and then extension, the arm and the leg are working together, and that's bringing an awareness of our left and the right side of our body. And that's called the homolateral integration. So center, then we have upper body, lower body, and then we have one side and the other side. That is often integrated fairly soon after the first one. The first one, often with babies, it's integrated around about 3 or 4 months. It might be a bit later, but it probably isn't before. And then the next one after that is when we can do this, will involve more complex movement. So we said the other was a reptilian. So that, sorry, I forgot to give an example of that, a lizard sort of slithering along the ground. So the first movements, the first new movements, the amphibian and the reptile, we're very close to the earth. And that's really what the baby needs to discover before they start standing up, or well, before standing, even crawling, or even a bit before sitting, because sitting is a different position. It's a more upright position, is to really feel a connection to the earth, like a frog and like a lizard, which is wiggling along on the earth. And then after that, we start to develop more complex movements, which are more mammalian movements. So like a dog, often I give as an example, but I mean, any four-legged being. And we're starting to move away. And we know that's integrated when we can cross-pattern crawl. So that's when we crawl and we're doing the opposite with the arm and the leg. So if I'm bending one leg, then the arm on the opposite side is extending, and that's how I move along. So we'll be practicing that movement. But that's the integration of it. Before that, the baby is going through lots of different, again, playing with opposite hands, crossing over the body is one of the main features of this movement. And that's actually quite important for helping the right and left brains to integrate. That when the baby starts crossing. So again, as a parent, we don't want to be taking the baby's arm and leg, and let's tap, because actually it's quite a complex movement. I really like the clapping games that people do. I often use that as an exercise as well to get people to sense, is that when you clap with a clapping game, you always center, and then you open the two hands and you put your two hands together. So that's more the homolateral movement, the amphibian. Then you come together. So you've actually got the coming together, then also touching something. So it could be the arm and the leg if you were to do it for yourself. But then the next one is crossing over. And that's much more complex. But if you just do crossing over, it gets really confusing. So you've always got to come back to the centre. Then you can open up. Then you can come back to the centre, and then you can cross. So all those clapping games, which sadly have been lost a lot with phones, it's really good to get children to do that, to just get much more embodied, and that will help them a lot with their brain development, their reflexes, their capacity to be more in their body. And so that's the mammalian movement. And then that's crawling. Is not usually much before 5 or 6 months. That's quite early, and some babies don't crawl till about 8 or 9 months or even later. So there is a lot more variation on that. For me, I think it's really important remembering with the amphibian and the reptilian movements that the front is very much in contact with the earth. And so it's really important for babies, and that's what we'll be doing in our movements, to have time on their front. I mean, they could be on their front on the floor, They could be on their front just being held against the mother. So if you carry your baby in a sling, they're getting a lot of that stimulation. Or you could even do movements with holding the babies on your knee and things like that. They don't always have to be down on the floor, just holding them, so that we're really stimulating the front of the body first. Then that helps increase abdominal tone, because after the crawling, we're wanting to come more to the upright position. So that's much more the primate position. So to come upright, we start to use, so we actually then do repeat some of the movements. So it's not like you do one and then it's integrated. There's different levels of integration. So when you start climbing to pull yourself upright, of course you're using all the previous movements. Still, as adults, sometimes we do things, you know, we do things with our two hands. Actually, I forgot to show one of the reflexes for that. That's when you touch the hands, the Badkin reflex, and then the baby opens their mouth. And so you also, another way you know that the baby's integrated that is when they do things with their hands and their mouth doesn't open. But again, even adults, sometimes you see they're doing things with their hands and their mouth's moving. Obviously, maybe not as much as a little baby, but you see, oh, they can't do something with their hands without doing something with their mouth. The reflex isn't completely integrated. Anyway, so you see, we still need this movement to help draw us up. We obviously might be coming into a squatting position. So again, we are still doing the same with our legs, our two legs, or the same with our two arms, but we've got the choice. We could do alternate climbing and climbing and climbing. I'm not going to change my screen, I'll just step further back, because the first movements of a baby are much more kind of tottering, like a primate movement. So they don't have as much coordination as an adult. And again, we can see that this cross-pattern movement isn't integrated if we actually do a movement where we're moving the same side, rather than when we're walking. We're hopefully, sorry, I can't show this to you, where we're walking and we can actually do a different movement with a different side. So bending the leg on one side and extending the arm on the other. That shows that we've integrated that mammalian movement. Anyway, we come into a primate, and then eventually we could stand and we could be like a bird. I've flown off the screen, but we can open up our arms, and we also remember our bird-like nature. So we'll come back to just having a moment to feel that in your body, and I'm just going to guide you through some of the movements. Now, just to say with these movements, they're not necessarily that easy to reproduce as an adult. And so if you don't want to join me in doing the movements, just imagine. You could do it as a visualization. You just connect with the animal that relates to the phase that we're going through. And then that might bring up even memories. We have a cellular memory, I believe, of our connection with the animals. And it's really nice to remember our animal-like nature, I feel, from time to time. So I invite you either to visualize or to do some of the movements with me. And we'll go back to being in water, in the womb. And so to get that feeling of the movements in your legs and your arms, actually we'll start with the snake. We'll do the 2-week bilaminar disc, but you're flat. And I've done it on my tummy because actually the front of your body is more turned inside your mother, and the back of your body is more turned to the outside, because the front of the body will eventually connect you to your placenta. And so just resting, but feeling a bit like you're in water. You're very fluid, like a water snake. And so keep your hands together and your feet together if you're doing the movement, or just visualize your body being like a watery snake, fluid and moving. You don't have a mouth at this stage. You're just a flat line with a front and a back and a top and a bottom, and you just wiggle. Feel that primitive water organism of a snake and your memory of organising around your midline. And you might want to practice some of the movements of rolling, if you feel like rolling, or you could visualize yourself rolling. Rolling is actually a much later movement that babies make in a conscious way, but rolling, all of these reflexes help you roll. You could also practice being like making a sort of C. So all on one side of your body, you feel a bit more of a contraction. And then you come back to the center, and then you do the same on the other side, keeping your arms and your legs together, and you just feel contraction on one side. And then you come back to the center, lying on your back now, feeling the difference in orientation, feeling the water. And then gradually now we'll come into this starfish. So you're organizing around your navel. Maybe if you're not actually doing a movement, you're visualizing. Place your hands on your navel and really feel the movement of your breath, but not just your breath. Imagine the movement of blood coming through your umbilical cord, attaching to your placenta, which is attaching to your mother. And feel how you received all your nourishment through the placenta, but you also eliminated through the placenta. So you're starting to organize around your navel. So you might want to now do some movements where you connect with your two legs going into flexion and extension. And then your two arms. So you can see how this prepares for the frog-like movement. And for us, it's harder with our heads to imagine that the head is a bit like on a par with our hands and our feet, but we also have a tail, our pelvis. So we're like a starfish, and we can open out into the watery space, and we can gather back in. So feel that fluid nature first before we become a frog, an amphibian. We're just like a starfish floating in the waters of the womb, organising around our navel. And then we're born. And there's a lot of strengthening of the midline. So our midline always remains the basis for all of our movements. We've already done quite a lot of the movements of the midline, but just imagining now that you're on the land and there's something that you can push against, and that you're now a land snake. So feel your belly on the earth and wiggle. Wiggle, and you can roll. You're not as fluid as you were when you were in the womb, but you can roll. You can curl up, and you can lengthen. And just imagine you're a snake moving through the land, moving on grass or in the sand. And you're wiggling along, slithering through wherever you're going, quite relatively slowly. But every now and then you might catch a prey, and you'll remember the snakes have a big head and a big tongue. So you might do a movement with your hands to imagine, the snake reaching out, and darting around and looking, or even swaying. Could be a snake more coming up and swirling. And really connect with that snake-like nature of your midline, curling up and down, opening up and gathering in, but still based on the earth. And when you curl up to sleep, you really rest
Imagine curling up like a snake, resting, finding somewhere safe to rest. And then you emerge into being frog-like. And so the frog, sometimes we call this in yoga like a bit like the child's pose. But obviously with a little baby, they haven't got the same control. And so you're a frog and you imagine being a frog. So the baby is often developing the movements just much more subtly. But I want you to feel being a frog where you can actually, if you push your two hands, you'll move back. So get two hands and push back. Obviously for a baby it takes quite a long time to develop the actual movements that I'm showing, which show that they're integrated. Before it's more movements with the hands and the feet, like I showed before. But now connect with this frog moving forward and backwards. For us, if you're doing the movement part of it, you might even want to practice a bit more frog movements where you're jumping forward, you're a frog moving along, you might be jumping back, you're more likely to be jumping forward. But you can see that involves quite a lot of strength. It's not so easy to do as an adult for a very long time. So that's the frog movement. And then with each of these movements, we're coming a bit further away from the ground. So as we start developing the mammalian movement, and I've already said that the full expression of that, or the integration of that, is when we can cross pattern crawl, both forwards and backwards and sideways, where our opposite arm and leg are doing the opposite things. So this cross pattern crawling, like a mammal, like a dog. But again, sometimes you see dogs and they'll do the same side. So you still got the movement before, but you know it's fully integrated when you can do this cross patterning, opposite arm and opposite leg. And you're like a mammal, a dog, but you're also, the important feature of this is you're further away from the ground, because this will actually lead into a further stage of integration of all the movements where you can actually reach forward into space, and then you start being able to grasp for things and reach. And that's taking us towards our human nature. So this is the dog, but dogs or other mammals are wandering around. Dogs they can move faster than lizards. They can turn around, change direction more quickly, but they also want to rest. So we can rest, and they can they might lie on their side to rest, but they also might like to lie on their back to rest. And sometimes they even put their legs, their forelegs up in the air. And babies often do that as well. Maybe not to rest, but babies often quite like, so this is an earlier movement with the baby before they have integrated it enough to be like a dog, and they just start to grab their opposite leg with their hand. So they're crossing over the midline. So see what that does to your brain as you cross over the midline, coming into a baby movement. And then becoming the dog, because once a baby can crawl, then fairly quickly they start, so you see there is a bit of a repetition of this movement, they start to pull themselves up to come to standing, and standing, they are becoming more a primate. And so feel how that is. Also, the thing is now, we're actually rediscovering our midline in a different way. It's now orientated not to the earth, but to heaven and earth, or heaven and earth, the sky, with our head now being at the top. And in a way, you can say that when we first leave the primate, we might be doing the same thing with each leg, and then we gradually develop our capacity to do walking opposite movement. And then, sorry, I don't have my head here, but you can become a bird and fly and connect with the space and find a different orientation again. And so that was a quick tour through the different movements. You can explore them longer, but what I'd like you to invite you to do now is either to lie down and rest or to sit, because I think it's quite nice to just give your bodies need time to integrate the words, but also the evocation of the movements, the images. And so it's nice after doing all of this to just take a moment to be still. Maybe to close your eyes. So as I said, you could be lying down. And just close your eyes and feel into how your body is now in your sitting position, which babies usually integrate sitting before they crawl. So they're getting a little bit of an idea of this new orientation. You can see how these different movements start to overlap. But just let your body come into stillness. Because I often find just talking about the movements or just having done some like we have, is giving your body a chance to repattern, maybe even integrating, or another stage of integration of reflexes, of movements. So stay sitting or lying in this position as long as you need. And I would also say, pay attention to your dreams. Maybe you'll dream of being an animal. And also pay attention to the different animals I've evoked, but all the animals, birds and insects, who we share this wonderful earth with, so we can respect our relationships with them. We have grown and evolved like them, emerging from the whole. So I'll allow you in your own time to take as long as you need. But I will now say goodbye and thank you for sharing this time with me. And if you have any questions or feedback, please do share below. It's always interesting and helpful to know how you experience this, and because we're always growing and developing and learning.